This evening we are chatting about sepia images. I'm going to touch on what a sepia image is and then also spend some time in Lightroom showing you all how to process a particular image in order to render a sepia look. So when you think of sepia, a lot of the time people don't think of monochrome. Because your standard monochrome images are your black and white, where you have a standard gray tone or grayscale tone to the entire image. And sepia images are very much the same thing. They're still a monochrome image, but instead of rendering and showing off a grayscale, you are now showing off and you're processing your image to a point where you are going to be showing off like a bronze or copper brown color in either your highlights or your shadows of the image. So it takes it from a grayscale to more of a brown coppery color. And it dates quite far back. I don't know if, I'm sure a lot of you on here would have shot film way back in the day. It's something I'm not too familiar with, but I do know that sepia dates way back where they actually would lay a positive of a particular image in a chemical toner, which was gathered or taken from a particular species that you'd find in the ocean. And it's a fish or a creature called the, sepia cuttlefish. That's what it is, a sepia cuttlefish. And it is a horrific looking creature and lives deep down in the ocean. And they use the ink from this animal to create this chemical tone. So in a dark room, they would lay these positives in a water bath with this toner in it. And then it will then render this copper brown color on the images. In the digital world, something I'm more familiar with, it is a bit easier. And it doesn't take as long as it used to back in the day of film. Diego, good evening. I hope all is well in Spain. Well, I'm glad it is off to a good start. But I'm going to be jumping into Lightroom now, and I'm going to show you how to go about creating a sepia toned image using Lightroom. And if any of you do have questions, please feel free to leave it in the Q&A tab. I will answer them at the end of the presentation. And yeah, let's jump into Lightroom. Okay, so here you see there are 4 images that I've put into a collection, and all 4 of them we are going to be converting into a sepia toned image. And the tool we use in Lightroom for this, let me just hit D to hit into develop, is one of the sliders, or one of the tabs on the right-hand side over here called split toning. And you will notice I do not have split toning in this particular panel at the moment. Reason being is because I purposely went to go hide it away. You can customize your Lightroom panels, may it be in library format, may it be in the develop module. And how you would do this is on any one of these names, just right click your mouse. Some would have to let me just close that, right click your mouse. Some will have to click customize develop panel, and some will just have the list of basic tone curve HSL running down the bottom here. But in my case, I have to select customize, and then I need to go and select my split toning. I'll save that, and you'll see it's appeared in my develop panel over here. So if you do not see it there, don't feel phased, just right click and go select it, and it will appear in these panels. So split toning is what we are going to use to render and create a sepia toned image. But right now I've got a tone scale gradient on the screen from pure black on the far left moving through into shadows, moving through into highlights, and all the way on the far right, you will find your pure white. And the reason why I put this in is just to show you how split toning really works. And you'll notice now that I've opened up this panel, you will see that this is again divided into 3 sections: highlights, shadows, and then balance in the middle. So what hue is, hue will allow you to go and choose a certain color within the color spectrum, and saturation is obviously how much of this color you are going to introduce. So if you don't want to try and figure out what color you're trying to use over here, just jump straight into this little rectangle over here, click on that, and this little color scale is going to jump up, and then you can go and click and hold and move your cursor around to choose different colors within the color spectrum. So and you will also see the percentages on the bottom right will tell you at what percentage you will find true blue. This will be at 100%, where you'd find like an orangey yellow, you'd get at 99%. And you will notice that the further I pull this down, the less saturated that color becomes, until I hit the very bottom, and we have then added 0 saturation. Sorry, I messed up there. This percentage on the right is how much of the saturation you're including in the image. So 100% right up at the top and 0% saturation right at the bottom. The degrees in the bottom left is now telling you where the particular color you are looking for is sitting within in the spectrum. So when it comes to sepia images, usually around 40 degrees is where you want to sit. So you will see that we are now rendering in the highlights. Let me take this down a little bit. At 40 degrees, we are rendering a copper browny color. Okay, but remember now, this is the highlights. And now how balance works is currently it's sitting on neutral, it's in the middle. So let me take saturation back down to 0. So you have a clear vision of what the tonal range looks like, from pure blacks to shadows to highlights to pure whites. And now notice, because my highlights, my hue is sitting on 40 degrees, which is this bronzy brown color, as soon as I move saturation to the right, the more I pull it right, the more intense that color becomes. But you will notice on this gradient, the pure blacks and the shadows aren't really being affected, because we're telling Lightroom, we're telling the software not to attack the dark areas of the scene and only work with the highlights. So you will see this general area in the scene is now getting this bronzy, coppery, brownish color added to it, and the pure whites are being left alone, because you cannot affect the colors of pure whites in a scene. The same is going to work. I'm just going to 0 saturation there, and the same will go for your shadows. So if I take that to 40 degrees, which is that bronzy coppery color, and if I then start increasing the saturation of the shadows, you will notice now the other half of the image, the left-hand side of the image, is being affected. All the shadowed areas are being affected, and you're getting this coppery bronze color added to it, but the pure blacks are being left alone. Now you may be wondering what balance is. So what I'm going to do, and I'm going to just change the color for the purpose of this exercise. I'm going to take it to like a blue color in the shadows and keep the highlights that coppery bronze color. So I'm just going to go punch the saturation quite a bit so it becomes quite obvious and we can see exactly what's happening. So now you will see that I've chosen a 40-degree hue on highlights. So therefore my highlighted area is getting this bronze copper color added to it. Whereas my shadows, I've added a blue color tint or color cast to it. And you will then notice only the shadows are getting the blue added to the shadowed parts of the scene. So what balance does here, because currently we're sitting on neutral, you'll notice if I start pulling this further to the left, attacking more of the shadows, what it does, if I take it to a negative 100, is your shadowed areas are heavily affected. They are blue. And this blue slowly fades as it reaches the highlighted section of the color scale. And then it slowly fades into a very pale peach color because you are now desaturating the highlighted areas by pulling balance into the shadowed side of that spectrum. If you go the opposite way from 0 to positive 100, you will then realize that most of the scene, or highlight part of the scene, is going to be affected from a very orangey, bronzy color. It's slowly going to fade away into the shadows, and there's going to be a touch of blue in the highlights. So that's basically how, excuse me, that's basically what split toning is and how it works and how it will affect your image. I hope this is making sense so far. So let's jump into the first image over here. So sepia images, as with monochrome images, can work for any scene really. And this comes down to personal preference. And you should just give it a go, give it a try, and see where it works for you, where it doesn't, and how you can use this creatively. So this is a raw image of elephants walking on a dam wall in Madikwe. And I have not processed this image whatsoever. I've just cropped it in a little bit. And the first step we will have to do is to take it into a monochrome image. So I just hit V, the letter V for Victor. This will take us straight into a black and white scene. What I will then do is I run through a general edit process. So I will just go and find my pure whites and pure blacks. So I've got a few specks there. I'll move my blacks, find pure whites or pure black. And then for the purpose of this particular scene, there's quite a lot of shadow on this side of the animal. So I really want to go and increase the amount of shadow quite a bit. The reason being is because for a lot of monochrome images, and then in turn for sepia images, particularly when it comes to wildlife, you want a lot of contrast pop in it. So I rid the shadows because there's still a lot of contrast and detail on the animals. And I can now clearly see the pattern and the shapes on the animal's skin. Over here as well, you can then become creative with highlights, because remember that nice bright sky behind them, you can either darken it up quite a lot or increase the amount of, or the intensity of those highlights. So for the purpose of this scene, I'm going to increase the highlights quite a bit. Texture, I'll increase a little bit to target the animal's skin and to pull out some of those wrinkles and those textures. Clarity is something I usually don't use in a general scene, but here I will, because I haven't purposely blurred out the background, because there is no background. So I will just add a little bit of clarity to the scene. I will then jump down into tone curve and furthermore try and lift and brighten up this image a little bit more. So let me go and increase light slightly. I can also go increase shadows a little bit more here, just to pop that a little bit more. And then I'm going to come down into my blacks and whites. So because we've now converted this image into a monochrome look and feel, you still have colors to work with. So remember, if I go hit V to take it back to the color image, you will notice that that sky is extremely blue. Notice now, and if you are struggling to find colors in the scene, if you just go hit this little pinpoint tool, you'll see the cursor has changed, and you will see that my blue spectrum has now got a little gray block over 0. It's telling me that this area of the scene is rendering blue. So if I go drop the luminance of that sky, it'll make it a lot darker. But obviously, when it comes to photography, contrast really works in your favor. So if there's a dark subject, which is the elephant, up against a bright sky, the elephant really pop out. So I'm going to go increase the luminance of that blue so that the sky becomes brighter and my dark subject really pop off of the background. I'm also going to go increase oranges a bit because the elephant were quite orange in color due to the Kalahari sand in Madikwe. You'll see this has also brightened up the foreground slightly. So therefore it's become less of a distracting element. So this would probably be it for my black or my color selections. I will then, before I head into split toning, let's jump into detail. Just increase a bit of sharpening here. I'm going to keep my radius at 0.5. Take details up to about 90 to target those finer details and edge contrast within the elephant. And then I'm going to go mask this image and make sure that only my elephant really get that sharpening tool applied to it, because everything that is now rendering black in the scene is not getting that tool added to it. So that will be about it in details. And for the purpose of this image, because we have all these sliders or these options on the right, doesn't mean we have to use every single one of them. So that is it for my basic general edit for this image. But let's go into split toning now. And for the purpose of this image, and the way I look at a sepia image, in the beginning I used to be quite harsh, and I would go and work both highlights and shadows to render a sepia looking image. But over the years of processing, and my style obviously had changed and I've developed as a photographer, you start noticing that less is more. So for the purpose of this image, I am just going to select the shadowed areas of the scene. There's a lot less shadow than there is highlight, as you would see in the histogram, a lot less shadows, because I've purposely lifted it. But now by targeting only the shadows and adding a 40-degree color spectrum to it, I'm going to get this coppery bronze color. And then you can go and obviously choose your saturation. How much of this color do you want to add in? So this is all personal preference. You can go heavy-handed and add a lot of the sepia color to it, or you can just be light-handed and lift it to about 40%. Go hit this on and off toggle, and you will see that it's taken it from a pure monochrome image, as we can see over here. If I put that back on, to a sepia looking image. And you will notice that because I only targeted the shadowed areas, the sky hasn't really become too orange, and only the darker parts of the animal have become this nice bronze, brown, copper kind of color. So remember, less is more. It is not always easy, but the less you do to a photograph, the better it could potentially turn out. Okay, moving on to the next scene. You might be thinking, Mike, are you absolutely mental using such a beautifully saturated, tranquil, and calming scene in terms of these colors? Why make it a sepia looking image? Why take away the color? Great thing about Lightroom is that we can create virtual copies. So even though we've only taken one photograph, you can make copies of this exact photograph 100 times if you like. So let me hit G. This will take me to grid view. I will then push and hold Command and hit apostrophe, and you will then see I now have copy number 1. So this is my raw file on the left. I now have a copy over here. So this image was already processed to a point in order to show off these beautiful colors. And the reason why this particular image, and also why a lot of landscape images, which we will get to, work for either monochrome or sepia type images, is because you have different levels of not only highlights and shadows, but tonal ranges. So in this image, it's obviously clear to see in color that we've got these soft blues, these purples, moves into like a light orange to a yellow, and then it moves off into like a pure white. And because of these color tones, it will lend us the opportunity to create a very cool and moody looking monochrome and or sepia image. So let's jump into this. I'm going to hit V. And as I've mentioned, this image was already processed to a point in order to create those different tonal ranges as we can see here. So right now, It's just loading at the moment because I created that virtual copy. It's just going to take a little bit of time. There we go. Okay, it's loaded. And now you'll see I've still got those levels of, or different levels of highlights throughout the scene, different levels of shadows throughout the scene, which really looks good. And I will then jump into develop by hitting D, come into split toning. And then here, because there's a lot more shadow in the scene than there is highlights, I would probably lean more towards creating that sepia look in only the highlights of this image, because there is less highlights rendering in the scene. So let me go and get 40 degrees over here. There we go. Close that up. And now you will notice that only the highlighted areas are getting this moody bronze or coppery color added to it. For the purpose of this exercise, let me go into shadows, also choose an area around 40, close that up. And now you will see that both the shadowed areas, being the mountains and that distant horizon, some of this foreground, is getting this color tone added to it. But in my opinion, and this is just a personal preference, it is a bit too harsh. It's a bit too hard when it comes to what we're trying to create. Obviously, we can be lighter handed on the saturation side of things to add less. But in my personal opinion, rather try and target the look, have a look at your image and see, okay, are there more highlights or more shadows in this scene? And what I've figured over the years is that if you go and target the minority of the scene, so the highlights here obviously make up a lot less of the scene. If you then go and alter this image into sepia, rather target the highlights and not the shadows for this particular scene. The reason being is because the effect that you are able to show off is a lot more subtle. And photography comes down to this. You want to be as subtle as you possibly can. And as strange as that sounds, less is more. Trying to keep it as simple as possible usually lends itself to a better outcome. So looking at that, putting this on and off, you can see it's taking only the highlighted areas into a sepia look and feel. And if we go into the before and after, there we go. Obviously that's a dramatic difference and a very different looking scene. But thanks to these different color tones on the horizon back here, it's still, because of the dramatic change from a very dark blue to a dark purple to an orange to a light yellow to a highlighted top part of that scene or this image. I see someone's question and I will get to that as soon as we're done. Thank you. But because of these harsh levels of tonal changes, we're still rendering and keeping that hazy look and feel within this sepia image. Okay, so just to recap, let's rewind back to, that was the original, but going into the elephant, because there were less shadows in this scene, I decided to make my effect on, or my sepia effect in the shadowed region of this image, because I stand a greater chance by over-processing the sepia look and feel to this image if I target the majority of the scene, which is the highlights. And then I did the opposite for this image. I targeted the highlights because there is a lot less highlight in the scene than there are shadows. Okay. And then moving on to our last image for this evening. And this is one of my favorite places in the world. It is an absolutely phenomenal mountain range in Iceland called Vesterhorn, which is Western Horn really, because of the horns that are represented on this mountain range. And as I mentioned, landscape images often lend great opportunities to photographers to either create a pure grayscale monochrome image, as we can see over here, or to work it into a way that we're presenting a sepia look and feel. But for the purpose of this image, I'm going to use two different colors and change the look and feel of this image entirely. And you need to remember that when it comes to working with two different colors, and particularly in split toning, where you can then say highlight should be X color and shadow should be Y, it's wise to remember to use complementary colors. Because if you work with colors that clash and don't work well together, you're obviously going to get a bit of a negative response from your viewers. So complementary colors are important if you are going to actually go with the term split and divide it into two and keep the highlights one color and the shadows another. So this image I've also processed to a point where I am happy with the outcome of the foreground, the mountain, and the detail in the sky. But let's start with the shadows here. And again, the dark shadowed areas, again, is the majority of this particular scene. It's making up the majority of it. So let's go choose a 40-degree in the saturation or the hue, and then start lifting that saturation. And you'll see only the shadowed areas are really getting that bronzy color added to it. And then now one thing I want to introduce to the scene to change up the sepia looking image and add a cooler softening, or a cooler and softer, more appealing color, because remember sepia, these warmer colors are often referred to as aggressive colors. They're quite harsh and hard. Whereas your blues, your turquoises, your greens, these are softer, cooler colors, and they're a lot more tranquil and calming. So one way in which I want to divide this image up between kind of soft and hard or moody and tranquil is I'm going to go choose a blue, or like just an off blue color for the highlights, somewhere around there. Again, right now it looks a little bit funny because things aren't really matching up. It seems like they're fighting against each other. You have the warmer shadowed areas trying to compete and fight with that blue area of the highlights. And this is where balance becomes quite an important tool. Because as soon as I start pulling balance further left, remember what will happen? It's only going to dominate the warmer colors of the shadows that you've applied to the scene. If I pull this image further to the right, or this slider further to the right, it's mainly going to hero the highlighted areas and make this image very blue. So what we can do here is we can go find a sweet point that to you works best. And this could either be around -17 or so, where you still, let's go increase the blue slightly, the saturation. So obviously the more you pull saturation to the right, closer to 100, the further you will have to pull balance to the left in order to hero the shadowed parts of the scene. So let's just pull that back slightly. And right now, to me, this looks pretty cool because you have this slightly blue-gray sky and grass in the foreground while you're still maintaining a nice warm and moody look to the foreground. So if I go and put this on and off, you'll see that's made quite a tremendous change to the standard black and white or monochrome image. If we want to go the other way and hero more blue, we'll have to drop that saturation a little bit because it's a bit too heavy up there. But if I pull this further to the right, this image will become and render more of the blue highlighted areas. But now we can pull the saturation further right, add a bit more warmth in the shadowed areas. Let's pull that a bit further right. And let's go a little bit more. There we go. So now we can maintain a nice gray off blue color to the sky while we're still rendering a nice sepia or a warmer tone in the foreground. And if we jump between the before and after of that image, it's quite a tremendous difference. And then if we take it back to just standard monochrome, you can see that effect is quite big, quite large. And I mean, you can go any way with colors here, and it comes down to experimenting. And the best way to learn is to play around and figure it out. If you don't know what a tool does, pull it all the way right, pull it all the way left. And eventually you'll start figuring out, okay, I know exactly what this tool is doing now. And this is the best way to learn. With colors as well, get yourself a color chart or a color wheel. You can find a lot of them on Google Images, and go see what complementary colors are. So right here, a blue and a warmer orange are complementary colors. They're working well together. And that's why adding them into the scene is really creating a very tranquil, calming mood, because of that blue you introducing into the scene in your highlights is adding calmness to the scene. But again, you're still hearing the moodiness of this landscape and that mountain, and amplifying it by adding a warmer color in the foreground. I hope that all makes sense. Okay, so mic is open. You can feel free to run with any questions you potentially have regarding this process. I see 2 chats came in. Okay, no questions in chats, but if you do have questions, there are 2 questions in the Q&A tab already. So Anne, you have asked, would the rhino picture also have worked as sepia easily without having it developed in color before? I guess you have worked the sky in the color version. So yes, and this is true. I focused a lot on the color image of that particular rhino image that we worked on, because when I initially imported and after I captured that moment, all I could think of were those vibrant colors, and geez, I love it. And I processed it to a point. But then before presenting this webinar, I sat and thought, okay, what images am I going to include to chat about during tonight's session? And it really struck me that even though you do have vibrant, moody, and beautiful saturated scenes, you can still convert those into sepia in a non-destructive way by creating virtual copies. And you could go either way. You could take that raw image without processing the colors of the sky and the depth of those colors in the sky. Because remember, when you are in Lightroom, let me quickly jump in here, and I'll continue to answer that question for you. So let me go back to this rhino image. So yes, I worked these colors heavily in that sky in order to get this end result. But as a monochrome or now sepia looking image, if I come into develop by pushing B and I go into B and W, remember now, if you're not sure, okay, what color was this, what color was that, what color was this, you find this little pointer tool. If you go hover over that area, you will see on the far right, next to my blue slider, there's a little gray block around 0. This is telling me wherever I'm hovering now is the color blue. The further I move up, there I've got magenta. Let me move up a little bit more. There I've got reds. Let me move up a little bit more. There I've got orange. And so it will change as you move around the scene. So even if you've processed this in black and white or in sepia, you can still go and target individual colors. So let me go and draw blues all the way down, and you'll see that area is really going to go quite dark. Or I can go lift it up a lot, and you're really going to lift detail in that area. For what was above blue, magenta, move this all the way to the left. You're going to really darken up that stretch across that first hazy piece of mist in the area. Pulling it right, you're going to brighten it up. So obviously for the purpose of this scene, because there are so many colors you want to work with, it may be easier, Anne, to process it in a color format first and then take it into monochrome and work it further from there. But if you're okay with using that little pointer tool to tell you exactly what colors you're working with, you can then process it straight into a black and white and process it into a sepia from the get-go. But that's a great question. Thank you for asking that, Anne. And then Francois, you asking, what about using sepia presets, left panel as a starting point? You can do. So Lightroom does have a lot of good presets that come with it by default, and all presets that you can purchase online. But in my opinion, and when I just got into photography and started working on Lightroom, I went the preset route often because it was a quick fix. You hit a button and it's kind of there, and then you can move on from there. And it's pretty much now the same as auto tone in your basic panel, where you can hit auto or auto tone, and in the basic panel, Lightroom usually does its thing. It usually takes highlights to the left, shadows all the way right, a bit of whites, a bit of blacks, and it gives you a good starting point. By no means is this the end result. But in my personal opinion, and over the years of shooting, what I had started realizing is that every single image is unique. So say, for example, that rhino image, if I took a shot, 10 minutes later, I take another shot, the light has changed dramatically. So therefore, it's going to require a very different setting. So by using a preset may work for a particular scene, but of that same scene, 5 minutes later, the preset you used for this scene may necessarily not work for the second scene. So it can be quite dangerous moving into the preset world, but it definitely is a good starting point, Francois. Thank you for bringing that up, and thank you for asking the question. Okay, Tracy, I would never have thought of processing the beautiful color rhino image, but it really does work. It does. And it just comes down to experimenting. As I'd mentioned, I was looking at images to add into tonight's webinar, and I sat back, I was looking, that particular rhino scene I think is definitely one of my top 2 rhino scenes ever. And it was photographed in Madikwe Game Reserve at a dam called Klo Dam, one of my favorite spots in Africa. And every time I go through my Madikwe images and I come across that image, I usually take like 5 minutes and just sit back, look at the image and kind of relive that moment, because it was so phenomenal. And while I was sitting there just enjoying and taking in that if I didn't experiment with it, I would never have known. And that's the beauty about Lightroom, is that all the edits you do to your images aren't destructive. They're not going to change your raw image forever. It doesn't even touch your raw image. It's just rendering information from your raw image in order to make these changes. And I worked it worked well. And now I know color, very saturated layers of color could really work well in a monochrome or sepia form. So if you don't why am I always wanting to say experience? If you do not experiment, you will never learn and you will never know. So get to experimenting and experiencing if you want to. Are silhouettes generally good candidates for split toning? Definitely. Chris, great question. Silhouettes could really be good candidates for split toning, particularly if you want to keep the sky, again, if you want to do a proper split tone and not do sepia, you can always keep that sky. If you're obviously shooting silhouettes, are usually early mornings, late afternoon, so the sky is very moody, orange, and some nice warm colors. You can split tone that to keep the sky more orange and the foreground a softer green or a softer blue or turquoise color, in order to split those tones and have complementary colors working together in one scene. Definitely silhouettes will be perfect candidates for split toning. Great question. Thank you for asking. Do we have any more questions this evening from anybody? Okay, one just popped in. Roderick, thank you for the question. What range of separation would you maintain a realistic looking result? Again, Roderick, that comes down to personal preference. So you need to create an image, and you are going to want to show off an image which is you. So I'm not sitting here saying, yes, I really want to, well, I see an image of, say, for example, Marlon. He's a great photographer. I really look up to his work. I'm inspired by his work. But if I sit there and say, okay, I want to create a leopard image exactly the same as Marlon's. Why? He's already created it. Let's try something different. Take some time, look at an image and say, okay, how can I improve that image? And then take it from there. So yeah, it's quite a broad question, that, Roderick, because it just comes down to a personal preference. And what may be realistic to you might not be realistic to me, and vice versa. But as I mentioned, usually less is more, particularly when you're trying to keep it as realistic as possible. Less is definitely more. Thank you for that question. Oh, saturation. Okay, so same answer. It comes down to how much is working for you. And as I'd mentioned in the past, I used to be quite heavy-handed, and I'd add a sepia tone to both highlights and shadows. I'd really crank it and make it like super bronze and like really orange. And over the years, I started realizing, well, back then it was cool to me. I enjoyed the look and feel. But as I developed as a photographer, I've become a lot more subtle in my approach when it comes to images like this. So you can find that sweet point that works for you and push it out there. Thank you for the question. I really appreciate it. Okay. Yeah, I think that is the questions from everyone. If you haven't thought of a question yet for this evening, if you do have questions in the future, please, I'm a quick email away. I will happily get back to you. And thank you all again for your time this evening. I really do appreciate you taking some time on this beautiful Tuesday to spend it with me. I hope you've learned something. I hope you feel inspired. And yeah, Sally, you just need to practice it. Indeed, it's all about practice. The more you do it, the better you will become at it, I can assure you. But thank you all once again for this evening. It was great. Have a great day further. And if your day is nearly over, enjoy your evening. And we will speak to you all in the near future. Have a good one. Thank you. Bye-bye.